How did this regular landing turn into an unsuccessful attempt to keep the plane on the runway? An aircraft with a very excellent safety record, one that was created for airports and runways exactly like these, but which nevertheless failed and is the subject of today's video. This is the story of Atlantic Airlines Flight 670. There are several aircraft that are designed to function in various settings. Given the diversity of the world, it stands to reason that various kinds of equipment will be required in order to specialize in one specific region more effectively than others, in order to reach and serve as many people as possible. An example of one of these aircrafts is the British Aerospace 146. This line of aircraft, which was made in the UK, was formerly among the most widely used regional aircraft worldwide, having 4 engines on such a little aircraft and using a fairly unusual design. In order to operate better on short runways, it was specifically constructed in this manner. The plane's handling characteristics and simplicity of use are often praised by the pilots in glowing terms. Several of the world's top airlines used this type throughout its years of manufacturing and service in commemorance. Atlantic Airlines of the Faroe Islands was one of the carriers. The Faroe Islands are a small group of islands tucked away in the North Atlantic between Iceland and the Scottish Shetland Islands. As its operational hub, Vagar Airport is technically a part of Denmark. However, Atlantic Airlines operates from there. But Atlantic Airlines also let out some of its aircraft, which on October 10, 2006, brought us to Stavanger, Norway. Notwithstanding being a Faroese corporation, Atlantic did rent one of the BAE 146s to Aker Solutions, an engineering firm. Aker and Atlantic were required by their contract to transport employees from Stavanger and the neighboring town of Stord to Molde, which is located farther north in the nation, every morning. The flight would depart from Stavanger and then make a brief stop at Stord that would last for around 15 minutes. 2 pilots would fly the flight on this aircraft that morning in October. The 34-year-old captain, Niklas Johus, had been a member of Atlantic Airlines for 2 years now. At the time of the tragedy, he had around 1,500 hours in this particular aircraft. 38-year-old Jacob Evald served as his first officer. At the time, he was a new employee of the airline and had a little less experience. He had flown in this particular aircraft for just 25% of his entire flying time, which was close to 1,000 hours. With the 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, and 12 passengers, there were only 16 people on board for the brief journey to Stord. Further passengers were scheduled to board in Stord. The famed Norwegian fjords and shoreline in this area of Norway, which is well known for its beautiful scenery, make the terrain challenging for setting up and running an airport. Storken Airport in Stord is situated on a hill with cliff drop-offs on the north, south, and east sides. The runway's length at the time, or little under 1 mile, was estimated to be 1,400 meters. It was designed for runways like this one, the British Aerospace 146. There is something odd about this airplane that could be worth discussing, since it will be important to remember for the discussion that will follow. Combining reverse thrust with standard brakes and spoilers is a common solution for aircraft. Real reverse thrust is not available on the 146. The rear of the aircraft does, however, conceal a quite intriguing gadget. Pilots would use an air brake that opens out at the back just before landing on a runway. Short runways and incline approaches benefit greatly from this technology. Even though the air brake isn't truly related to the accident, it is operated by a lever that is shared with the spoiler controls in the cockpit on the throttle console. The Flight 670 pilots were in contact with Bergen air traffic controllers after departing Stavanger. The disaster plane's pilots were first thought to be planning to land with a northward approach onto what was then known as Runway 15. This was the initial understanding from their communications. On that same runway earlier that morning, another Atlantic Airlines aircraft had just made a landing. The pilots quickly decided to alter their intentions and fly in from the south onto runway 33 as weather information started to come in and the airport started to appear on the clear day. Yet, landing with a modest tailwind would mean they would get at the airport sooner. Most of the time, pilots choose to fly in the opposite direction of the wind to slow down and make better use of the runway. An aircraft may really be propelled toward the direction of the wind when it is very windy. In a situation when there is a tailwind, the wind may make an aircraft fly faster, increasing ground speed in the process. On this particular instance, the skipper determined that a tailwind approach was just good, and he was right. With a tailwind and enough space to spare, the 146 could easily land on this shorter runway based on the aircraft's capabilities. Yet, this landing wasn't quite as easy. Let's go to the touchdown in order to examine what transpired. On a drizzly runway, Flight 670 made landfall. Even a contaminated status for the runway was possible. A contaminated runway in aviation refers to one that has a significant concentration of elements like water, snow, ice, or even tiny pieces of debris present or accumulating there. Because of the recent rain, the runway was wet, requiring a somewhat longer stopping distance than usual, but still well within the parameters for this aircraft at this airport. The runway at Stord was not grooved, which is equally crucial to observe here. This grooved feature is common on commercial airport runways. The trees may even divert water away from the runway in order to prevent water from collecting there. The pilots try to activate the wing spoilers after the aircraft has touched down. The spoilers are raised wing flaps that reduce lift by obstructing airflow. The air brakes did not deploy when the pilot turned the lever for the previously described air brake to the spoiler position. The throttle controls for at least 3 of the engines must be at the flight idle or lower position in order for the spoilers to operate properly. The throttle's placement was verified to be appropriate for this to happen. The pilots were informed through an alarm when the spoilers failed to deploy. The pilots had to think swiftly and respond to this situation. As soon as possible, the captain proposed using the maximum wheel brakes. He tried slamming on the brakes, but they weren't enough, so he soon activated the emergency brake of the aircraft. The emergency brake on the aircraft was not equipped with anti-skid technology, causing the wheels to lock up. The aircraft's ordinary brakes were. This particular point in the problem's development was crucial, since it determined how the jet would fare because the locked wheels now collided with the soggy runway. Hydroplaning then happened as a result of the emergency brake being applied and the wheels locking. The rubber on the wheels warmed up as a result of this. A layer of steam is said to have accumulated below the wheels on this wet runway, which significantly reduced traction and, therefore, braking power. Because of the polluted runway, small tailwind, and increased ground speed due to this, not only did it increase the length of the runway required to stop in time, but it also left insufficient space. Surviving passengers also remarked that the jet was taking longer than normal to slow down, even though the pilots were trying furiously to do so in the ensuing seconds. To reiterate, the pilots did have brakes, albeit they weren't nearly as efficient. Captain Duras turned the jet abruptly to the right, then to the left, in an effort to skid the plane in a last-ditch effort to stop. Just as predicted, the jet did not halt in time and overran the runway's end. They could have gotten there if the runway had been a little bit longer. Rather, the jet slid down the rocks that surround the airfield. When it came to a stop and caught fire, Flight 670 had just crashed through the woods and down the cliff. It was still quite early in the crisis at this time. The cockpit door was blocked, and even though both pilots had survived the collision, they were still trapped within the cockpit. The cockpit window was where they had to leave. The aircraft's second engine, located on the left side, could not be shut down by the pilots using the checklists. The sole exit utilized, it should be emphasized, was the left side door at the back of the cabin because of how the aircraft came to rest on the cliff, forcing passengers to virtually climb up the plane. Unfortunately, 3 passengers and 1 flight attendant were killed in the accident, and the cabin was engulfed in flames. The whole fuselage was completely destroyed by flames, leaving behind parts of the aircraft that were unrecognizable. The specific reason why the spoilers didn't deploy wasn't known with certainty after the accident inquiry. They offered 2 justifications in their report, however. One being a possible issue with the throttle controls, which would prevent the transmission of the information required to declare that the engines were adjusted properly for the spoilers to deploy. The air brake spoiler lever has a mechanical problem as the second possibility. According to the investigation's conclusions, the runway may not have been grooved when the aforementioned hydroplaning happened. Hence, it was suggested that Stroud Airport put this feature on its runway, and this was really done. Today's runway has been lengthened in addition to having grooves in it. In Stroud, there have never been any further mishaps. That's all for now. I appreciate your interest, and I hope to see you next Sunday.